In this part of the methods review, we will discuss event-related potentials, including those that are of particular relevance to the study of language. Event-related potentials are brain responses that are associated with a specific sensory, cognitive, or motor event. Such responses, when measured by electroencephalography or EEG, are called ERP, or event-related potentials. Those that are measured with magnetoencephalography or MEG are referred to as event-related fields, or ERFs. The two broad classes of ERPs are evoked and induced responses. Evoked responses are both phase and time locked to the event. Their signal-to-noise ratio can be enhanced by averaging individual trials or presentations of an event over time. Induced potentials, on the other hand, occur after the event, but are not phase-locked to it. They represent modulation of ongoing brain activity by the event. Averaging of response waveforms over multiple occurrences of an event, or trials, is a common practice that can be used to enhance the strength of the evoked response relative to noise. The greater the number of trials used for averaging, the lower the amplitude of random noise is in the average signal. This relationship is illustrated in the left panel of the figure. The right panel presents examples of evoked potential waveforms averaged over different numbers of trials. One can see that increasing the number of trials leads to a more prominent evoked response. The portion of the average signal before the onset of the event becomes essentially a flat line. The auditory evoked potential is an average response that reflects activity associated with processing of sounds in the brain. Auditory evoked potential components are characterized by their latency. They are often named based on their polarity, N for negative and P for positive, their order, for example, N1 or P2, or latency, for example, P300 or N400. AEPs are associated with specific generators in the brain, that is, specific brain regions that generate the neural activity that is then reflected in the AEP as captured by EEG or MEG. And these potentials reflect specific sensory or cognitive processes. Auditory evoked potentials can be subdivided based on their function into sensory and processing contingent potentials. They can also be subdivided based on their generators, beginning at the level of the cochlea, then the auditory nerve or the eighth nerve, the brainstem, or the cortex. They also can be classified based on their onset latency. Depending on their temporal relationship with the stimulus, AEPs can be transient, that is, occurring upon the beginning of the stimulus, or steady state and sustained responses persist throughout the duration of the stimulus or event. In the following slides, we will briefly discuss several cortical evoked potentials that are of particular relevance to speech and language processing in the brain. The middle latency response. It occurs between 10 and 50 milliseconds after sound onset. Its most prominent components are NA, PA, and NB. This response can be elicited by simple non-speech stimuli such as clicks or pure tones. It is generated in the early auditory cortex, including primary auditory cortex. Impaired middle latency responses, when the auditory brainstem response is normal, are indicative of central auditory processing disorders and thus have an important clinical utility. An example is shown in the figure on the left, where a patient with a tumor involving the right thalamus has impaired middle latency responses in the right hemisphere and normal middle latency responses on the left. Long latency auditory evoked potentials occur between 50 and 600 milliseconds after stimulus onset. Their most prominent components are P1, N1, and P2. Long latency auditory evoked potentials can be affected by attention to the stimuli. This is illustrated in the figure which shows the auditory brainstem response, middle latency response, and long latency auditory evoked potential responses to clicks that are presented when listeners ignored them in the left column or attended to them in the right column. You can see that while the auditory brainstem response and middle latency response are essentially identical between the two conditions, the long latency AEPs, especially the P2 later P2 component, are larger in the condition when the listener was attending to the stimuli. Generators of the long latency auditory evoked potentials are in auditory and auditory related cortex, specifically superior temporal gyrus for N1 and more anterior temporal cortex P2. These auditory evoked potentials have a clinical utility in the diagnosis of neuropsychological disorders. Next, the mismatch negativity is a response to a stimulus that deviates or mismatches previous stimuli. This response has a latency of about 100 to 300 milliseconds, thus it overlaps with N1 and P2. It can be revealed by comparing the auditory evoked potential waveforms recorded in response to standard and deviant or mismatching stimuli. It is dependent on sensory memory and long-term representations. This response is generated in the auditory cortex as well as prefrontal cortex, and it can be impaired in individuals with learning disabilities. Next, object-related negativity, or the ORN, is a response that occurs when listeners have to parse multiple concurrent sounds. For example, when they listen to harmonic complexes or speech vowels. Just like the mismatch negativity, this response can be revealed by comparing waveforms that are elicited in two different stimulus conditions. In the example shown here, between responses to tuned and mistuned harmonic complexes. This response has a latency of approximately 180 milliseconds, and thus it overlaps also with N1 and P2 components of the long latency auditory evoked potential. This response is generated in the auditory cortex as well as the thalamocortical network. The P3B or P300 is a processing contingent or endogenous response that is elicited in target detection tasks. It has a latency of about 300 milliseconds, hence it's called P300, and it is strongly affected by attention and task performance. It is generated in the parietal cortex, medial temporal lobe, as well as prefrontal cortex. This response also has a considerable clinical utility because it is affected in conditions such as mild cognitive impairment, congenital amusia, as well as language impairments. Now, let's move on to language-specific event-related potentials. The earliest of these, left anterior negativity, is elicited by word category violations. For example, a verb in a noun position. It is typically, though not always, left lateralized and appears over anterior EEG electrodes, hence its name. Early left anterior negativity components have a latency of somewhere between 100 and 300 milliseconds. Later effects occur at 300 to 500 milliseconds. This response reflects difficulty in syntactic processing and working memory load. The M400 is perhaps the most studied language-related, event-related potential, with a latency of, you guessed it, 400 milliseconds or so. It is elicited by semantically inappropriate words. For example, when you hear, "He spread the warm bread with socks." Naturally, you don't put socks on your bread. Most people will expect to hear something like butter or jam or honey. Unlike auditory evoked potential, M400 is modality independent. That is, it can be elicited by spoken words as well as written or signed words. Another feature of this interesting response is that it can be elicited by words that are semantically appropriate yet unexpected. For example, when you hear, "She was stung by a wasp," most English speakers would expect to hear bee rather than a wasp. There are different views on the processing nature of the M400. Some argue that it is a reflection of semantic integration into a conceptual context. Others interpret it as an index of difficulty of retrieving stored conceptual knowledge associated with a word. To make it more complicated, left and right hemisphere may have different roles in the creation of context representation. The possible generators of the N400 response include left and, to a lesser extent, right superior and middle temporal gyrus, as well as the left inferior frontal gyrus. Finally, the P600 is the event-related potential response to syntactic anomalies or ambiguities. For example, when a noun in a sentence is used instead of a verb. It is elicited by grammatically correct by less preferred syntactic continuations as well. And this response naturally has a latency of approximately 600 milliseconds. The possible functional significance of P600 includes reflection of difficulty of syntactic integration. It may be viewed as one reflecting the final stage of syntactic analysis and repair of contradictory information, as well as unification of syntactic frames into a phrasal configuration. Possibly, it may not be a single effect, but a family of effects reflecting distinct functional properties. The possible generators of P600 are left anterior superior temporal gyrus, left inferior frontal gyrus, as well as anterior cingulate cortex. In conclusions, event-related potentials provide a useful tool for the study of hearing, speech, and language function in humans. Middle latency response and the early components of the long latency auditory evoked potentials, specifically the N1, reflect audibility, that is, sound being registered by the auditory system in the brain. The P2, P3B, mismatch negativity, and the object-related negativity index discrimination and identification of complex auditory stimuli. Finally, the language-related ERPs, such as the N400 or the P600, are not limited to the auditory modality and index higher-level cognitive processing of language.